This is about a 40-minute video. It's a complex topic. Rebecca was an absolute joy to talk to. I hope you enjoy the edits. We talk everything intuitive eating and all the subcomponents of circadian rhythm, binge eating, emotional eating, the parents' role in meal times, and how parents can actually impact the relationship their children have with food. It's a fun topic. Jump around as you feel necessary. I apologize for the Zoom quality of some of the video, but it's the internet. I couldn't help that. Enjoy this. If you have any questions, let us both know, and definitely follow Rebecca and I on social media. The Instagram information is in the video. Check it out. Why don't you introduce yourself, Rebecca, and tell everyone who you are, what you do, and what your specialty is?
Okay. Well, I am Rebecca McConville. I am a sports dietitian and eating disorder specialist based in the Kansas City area. And kind of really over the years of finding myself in this specialty niche working with REDS, relative energy deficit in sport, and being able to define what is energy availability, finding what are some of the common pitfalls that may happen with that athlete or the parent that's feeling that athlete, and led me to write my book, Finding Your Sweet Spot. And now have actually created into a course not only for the athlete, but for the clinicians themselves, and being able to sort out the difference between when that athlete may be underfueled just by lack of knowledge, and then also being able to identify and support when they may be struggling with an undiagnosed eating disorder is really important.
Because all of that is all tied in together, and we have social pressures and parental pressures and coach pressures, and all of those pressures balled up into a competing athlete who's got a type A personality becomes a boiling point for doing a lot of things wrong that can have lifelong implications, wouldn't you say?
Right. I mean, they are humans too. So they're just as susceptible, if not even more, to fads on social media. Influencers, that's what always my younger athletes tell me. I'm following this influencer. I'm like, okay.
Right. So who was it? Was it Graham Close? No, Bob Seebahar. I've actually never met Bob, but he posted on Facebook the other day, what's your biggest obstacle to nutrition? And my answer was influencers.
Right.
Like, I'm not going to lie.
I saw that. I was like, amen.
Yeah. So I have to see. So this actually podcast that we're doing, or vlog, depending if you're listening or watching, is about intuitive eating, because we have back and forth on social media all the time when we're posting on each other's things. Intuitive eating is something that I bought a lot of books about, and I try to get into it and want to use it more in my practice with all athletes, male and female, and even my weight loss clients. But it's not something I'm fully on board with. And so for everyone listening or watching, Rebecca and I are going to have a conversation of professionals, and I'm really going to come at this as like, I'm kind of ignorant. I've read enough to be dangerous. I'm not sure I truly believe in it. I think there are major pitfalls. And Rebecca's a little more knowledgeable about intuitive eating. So I'm looking to improve my knowledge and educate myself as a practitioner to become better, which I think all practitioners should do. And that's where you're going to get, this won't be all high level, so don't worry. We will break it down, and I'll definitely add in post-edit when you watch this, different pictures and graphs to help make this more digestible by everyone. So when we talk about intuitive eating, there are two different types of terms are being coined out right now. If you were to do a Google search, mindful eating and intuitive eating. So Rebecca, I think they're different. Do you agree?
Yeah, I agree, because one is more the state of mind when you're eating. So hence the mindful eating, like imagine like Food Network, where they're all kind of quiet and they're savoring and enjoying. That's more what mindful eating, where intuitive eating is really connecting and understanding your physiological state and psychological state in that moment and asking your body, what does it need?
And so some of the three tenets for intuitive eating, right, are eating when hungry, like number one, stop eating when you're not hungry, so when you're full, and then no restrictions on the types of food eaten unless there's some type of medical necessity. Can we agree on those three tenets to start with?
Yes, we can agree.
Great. And so I agree. Mindful eating, I think, is a piece of the intuitive eating structure or framework. Like, we should be in the moment when we're eating instead of just eating so fast. I think a good example of this, and tell me if you agree or not, is it's kind of like when you have a bag of M&Ms and you have 2 or 3 M&Ms and you eat them so fast that you don't really pay attention, we don't continue to eat 2 more bags of M&Ms because we wanted 2 more bags of M&Ms. We wanted the experience we got. And if we could slow that experience down, there's no need for 2 bags of M&Ms. 10 would have worked because it's a duration or a period of time. Does that kind of fit in with your framework or idea of how that mindful eating works?
Yeah, absolutely. Because most of the time when we're thinking mindfulness, we're thinking satisfaction piece, being able to connect with the flavors, making it the whole environment that comes with it. And so if you're eating those M&Ms, you're probably not eating them for the nutrition value. You're eating it for the satisfaction. And so the French were really the first to explore that. And I have not been able to find the evidence base on this, but they believe that it truly only takes about 4 bites, hence the reason petit four dessert that they have, for the brain to reach its level of satisfaction and be done with that. So when we look at sweets, we really want to savor and enjoy them. We're not just sweets, any food that we're going to for satisfaction, and then have that be after you've had your fuel in your tank, which would be honoring the hunger part of intuitive eating.
And that's where I think things break down, is honoring that hunger part. And this dovetails really good into a video I just did about you're not really thirsty, you're actually really hungry. And we're not confused, is because we have different types of hunger. And that's something, when you and I counsel people, we have taste hunger. Like we want it because it tastes good. Mm-hmm. And that's, sugar, for example, lights up sensory in our brain. Like it has a direct effect. It's not like cocaine, but it has some sensory benefits to that. Like we're happy when we eat it. There are other foods, fat carries flavor. That's a chef terminology, right? Fat isn't flavor, it carries flavor. And so fatty foods carry a high flavor. We get that endorphin, serotonin rush. Things are happy. We want more. So it's like, I want that. So that's a taste hunger. Then we've got the practical hunger. Like I need to eat when I'm not hungry because of work or kids, or I'm going out with friends and I have to eat now or I'm not going to eat at all. So sometimes we have to disrupt that intuitive eating thing. And then we've got the emotional hunger aspect, which I think is the one that throws off the most given society right now, right? So for me, the difficulty with intuitive eating is it's broken. Like I think in most people it's broken because as children, we're taught how to not intuitively eat. Like our parents ruin this, not intentionally, right? But it's, hey, sweetheart, it's time for dinner. Hey, you've got to be hungry. Hey, it's lunchtime, come and eat. And we actually pull children in to stop their activities to feed them because we feel they need to be fed on the schedule. But if we let them eat, they'll stop. They'll show up, they'll eat, they'll go back and do what they need to do for 10 more hours and then show up and eat again. But I think we really are unteaching people how to be intuitive eaters at a very young age. And so I think it's completely broken. And I want you to tell me how it can be fixed, or where just me leaning on that alone is like, hey, Andrew, we can get past that. So why don't you talk to me about that?
Wow, way to start off with such a loaded question. Yeah, I do believe because of the nature of hectic schedules and trying to accommodate all these mouths when you're trying to feed, that we do interfere with their natural intuitive eating pattern. However, since kids lack an interoceptive awareness to their hunger levels, tired, going to the bathroom, sometimes I think they need that parental prompt to be like, hey, are you hungry? I've seen that with my own daughter. Well, we always used to joke that she'd have her Maddie meltdown because she would go. And then it was like, wham, it just hit her. Mm-hmm. And so over years of experience as a parent, I always knew like, okay, we're going to have to check her before she wrecks herself, right? Because she's way too tired. I think that's probably where we need to bridge, letting them guide it, but also having them check in, which is probably part of the mindfulness, right? Like, mm-hmm. Hey, you haven't eaten in about 6 hours. Are you hungry yet? No, Mom, I'm not. Okay, leave it at that. Or if they're out doing their sports, being able to say like, hey, we're not going to be able to stop and eat in 2 hours. Do you need to have something right now?
So we can probably be better as parents about helping foster a intuitive eating by asking, hey, are you hungry? Not saying, hey, you're hungry because it's such and such time because I feel you are. That's true as adults, but then we grow up as adults and we're like, hey, you're supposed to have breakfast, you need to have lunch, you need to have dinner, and oh my God, we need these 6 snacks throughout the day because of the whole blood sugar argument, which is a completely different podcast or vlog to really do. Like, where are we on the insulin camp, glycogen, all the glucagon, et cetera. But I think it's broken in adults. And I really don't think we know when we're actually hungry because we're told that we need to eat based on a clock. And if our stomach growls, it's too late. Well, it's not too late. Like, that's when you eat. How do you feel about that?
I agree. So there's 2 things that end up kind of interfering with that. Is one is if they've been chronic dieting, they've been told to eat on that schedule, they've been told what to eat. And so they actually lose those skills and ability to know what their body was trying to tell them. Mm-hmm. Not only that, but we know all that hormonal cascade that starts when they're dieting that just really disrupts normal hunger, normal fullness, their metabolism. Then the other part is that, the average American, years ago, I heard one of the leading medical experts say, it's the health of America that's going to run us in, which is really kind of ironic that we're in a pandemic right now, but just the lack of sleep, the lack of movement throughout a day. I find that most of my clients probably wait to eat till they're about an hour and a half past when they should. So it's like their new radar becomes being hangry and then being stuffed, and they've lost that ability to connect in between there, which is really where the work starts with the intuitive eating.
So the work starts with intuitive eating and not waiting so long, not stuffing themselves so far, not becoming hypoglycemic, and then not eating to the point of being gorged. And at that point, they're like, this is just normal. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, because when you get to that point, like when you are, like you talk about glucose, when you're to the point you're hangry, your brain has no fuel, your body is starting to feel really anxious and hungry. You're not going to want to sit down to a nice balanced salad. Your brain is going to want what is the quickest source of glucose I can get a hold of. It's also going to want the quickest source of foods, like you mentioned, that are going to give a serotonin and dopamine surge to calm that anxiousness down. And so that's where I feel like a lot of our impulsive, more convenient choices have taken over, because literally at that point, the brain and the body have to have it.
So we have very little impulse control. We probably are 0% mindful when we're just trying to get it in our mouth because we're hungry, at which point then we overeat because, like our mom told us, let your stomach let your brain catch up to your stomach, was a true thing. Like, hormones are like the mail system, right? It's a very slow delivery system where, let's use FedEx or UPS, right? Or something like that, where it's the central nervous system, it's lighten up rather quick. It does take some time for us to eat, the stomach to stretch, the hormones to tell us, hey, you're full. But by then you've had 2 or 3 servings beyond what you should have.
Right. Okay. I had a client put it perfectly one time. I had to get it clarified, but he said, one of my goals is I want to get to the point that I eat McDonald's because I want to, not because I have to. And I was like, what does that mean? Right. And then he explained it, that because they wouldn't have usually planned what they were having for dinner, they would be rushing around from activity to activity, and then it would get to that point that they were starving, and they'd look around and be like, oh, what's around? Well, most anywhere you can find a McDonald's, and so it'd be swinging through, scarfing in the parking lot, and then going on. I was like, okay, now that actually makes perfect sense. And I think that's where a lot of our culture has gotten, where they're to that point where what can I get right now to appease this? And of course, you're not going to have time to go home and cook or sit down and eat.
Yeah, that's actually funny you mentioned that. And I won't stay on this topic, but have you seen all of the social posts about the COVID cooking burnout? And we're like, yeah, so I see them all the time. Maybe it's because of the hashtags that I look at, but it's like, are you tired of cooking in COVID, cooking burnout? I'm like, wait a minute, that's how people just survived, is you got to cook.
Normal life.
Yeah, it's a normal life. Like, what are you talking about? Like, just because the restaurants are closed and you have to make your own food, the world is what's going on? But that takes me to the obesity component of intuitive eating, because we know intuitive eating increases leptin. Now we're leptin insensitive or desensitized to it. So leptin tells the body, hey, you're full. Like, you don't need to eat anymore. We're good on calories, back away. Well, lots of fat mass create large amounts of leptin. So it's kind of like type 2 diabetes in that your body's not answering the call to the hormone. Diabetes would be insulin, obesity would be leptin, which means an individual can eat and not be full, right? So that natural signal is gone. So how do we build or work intuitive eating into an individual where it is not it's broken, like physiologically broken?
So I will have them slowly start to work on scaling their own hunger levels and their fullness. And I challenge them to look for markers outside of physical fullness.
Okay.
And so, like, do they notice now they have a little bit more alertness in their brain? Does the food start to not taste as appealing? Are they noticing they can feel some presence of food in their stomach? And it gives them a template. And then I'll tell them, we're not going to starve you or restrict you, but let's put that plate up and let's let it sit there for 20 minutes. So now we're trying to get the postal service to come in and tell us what we need to know. And then if they find that they're still hungry, go back and have some more of that meal. But it could be that they're just needing a different parameter around how to identify fullness.
Okay. So in my practice, and so for everybody listening, like I'm here to be better at what I do, and I'm talking to a peer who knows more about something than I do. So I'm going to tell her a little bit about what I do in my practice with individuals who are overweight or have eating issues. I want you to use a smaller plate. I want you to fix your own plate. So if your husband or your wife has been doing it for you, we stop. Like, you are in command of your own plate. You fix your own servings, smaller than what you think, because you're an adult. You can always get up and get more. Sit down and eat, and then wait. And then wait 5 minutes before you decide that you want to go get more. And if you still decide or think you want to, then by all means, let's. But let's not start with these huge plates with huge portions you think you might want, and then you feel obligated to eat. I see this in a lot of my 55, 60 plus clients. And a lot of people think I only work with athletes, and that's not the case. But that generation doesn't like to throw anything away.
Oh yeah, clean the plate. I can remember what that was like.
Yeah. So like getting them to just use a smaller plate to not get as much food is a huge success for them, because now they don't have to throw things away. They actually have food left over, and they didn't eat it all because their husband or their wife put it on their plate, which is a big deal. So that's interesting. You use signs of, do you feel food in your stomach, to help cue or maybe reconnect that sense of fullness.
Yeah, so I'll give him simple things like, okay, could you walk around the block? We don't want you to be able to sprint around the block because that's probably not enough food. And we don't want you to feel like you can hardly get up and walk. That's too much.
Right.
Could you go for a gentle walk? Okay, then there's probably physical sensation of food. And then we want to see if it's enough, because remember, it's like a thermostat. We're trying to find what's that happy spot that gets them satisfied and then leads them to either, if they want a snack, I refer to snacks as energy extenders. They're kind of optional if you want some more energy to tie you over to the next meal, but they're not meant to be the same hunger level or same fullness as a meal. But I do believe, going back to your question about it being broken, I think we do have to help them, though, relearn by kind of putting a cast around their eating patterns. So I may tell them that, yeah, we need to have 3 meals with 2 snacks in, because you need to relearn what's an appropriate hunger level. Mm-hmm. And then we go back and we make sure that you have balance at all your meals, because sometimes that brain thinking about food or drive to eat may be that you only had eggs at breakfast, and now you're wondering why you're scarfing potato chips down at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Well, it's not a lack of willpower. It's the fact that you're not balanced eating throughout the day. Once we can establish that, then we learn what our physiological patterns are, and then they can start being curious. And that's where a lot of times, like in intuitive eating, they'll suggest that they really try to kind of eat with a little bit more structure, and especially with anybody that have worked with that's had an eating disorder for a year or more, so those hormone levels can balance out before they try to use their intuition.
It's interesting that you mentioned eating disorders, because one of the recent studies on intuitive eating, because there's not a lot, right? There's a lot of studies on hormones and mice and things like that, and we have some of the more popular intuitive eating guides like to go back to the starvation studies and things that were done a long time ago. And while some of that is useful, some of the most recent, like in 2020, was intuitive eating and eating disorders. And one of the most effective outcomes was medium to large reduction in disordered eating when we use intuitive eating as an intervention, reductions in body dissatisfaction, and then improvements in body appreciation. Now, both of those are typically tied to disordered eating, but with the intuitive eating, I think those two elements, the body dissatisfaction and body appreciation, are huge elements. But I get tripped up with, I feel like intuitive eating is not a weight loss. Like if you're looking to lose weight, intuitive eating is not for you.
Right.
Intuitive eating, in my opinion, is more of an acceptance and compassion and understanding who you are and being okay with the choices you've made, but also making better choices overall. And so like psychological outcomes seem to be a very positive benefit of i.e. intuitive eating, but weight loss, not so much. Do I have that wrong? Do you disagree?
No, you're exactly right. And the creators of intuitive eating, they will tell you this is not meant for diet or weight loss. But what's interesting is a lot of our culture views that they have to be in this restrictive diet to improve those markers of health. And what we're starting to see with 2 5-year data points is actually better A1Cs, better blood pressure. I know at some point there is going to be a analysis that's going to come out with 5 eating disorder clinicians that use intuitive eating with binge eating, and that some of them went off their diabetes medication because it was speaking to being more kind to that body. So therefore body dysfunction goes down, stress level goes down, and they were able to have better markers of health. So yeah, I think that's one thing that's getting distorted in our lovely social media is intuitive eating for weight loss, but those two do not go in the same sentence.
No, they don't. I mean, if you Google intuitive eating, you get things like, I'm never going to diet again. I'm just going to let my body do its thing. My body knows best. And again, I come down to the side of no, it didn't and it doesn't. That's how you got to where you are at the moment. So I think intuitive eating does need a guide. Like, and I'm not like building in, like, you got to go see a dietitian, but I don't think it's the kind of thing that you can embark upon by yourself. It's like cognitive behavioral therapy. You don't want to do it on your own. You need to be guided through a complicated process. So look, positive psychological outcomes in any era, right? But I would say now social media is incredibly beneficial and shouldn't be underrated by any means. Like being comfortable with how you are and how you eat, not having the stress hormones. Look, we've been talking about hormones.
So long term, though, we know that by trying to intentionally restrict calories or restrict past that point of appropriate hunger, the body is going to find a way to fight back to balance. They call it the reset or what is it? Reshoot theory. Yeah. But I do believe that within intuitive eating, they have the right, I always say it's their body, their right. Mm-hmm. So if they want to explore and play around with foods that are going to be more satiating and provide more fullness, and it just happens to be of less calories, there's nothing wrong with that. That's not dieting. So if they end up losing weight, okay, that's just a byproduct of it. But I think for one to intentionally try to get leaner, they're probably going to diet and they're going to end up with rebound weight gain.
I don't disagree. And that takes me to my next point of where I think I stumble with intuitive eating is because if we're left to choose, it's kind of like chocolate milk in the school system, which I'm sure somebody's going to comment on this. Like, look, if you have chocolate milk and you have regular milk, clearly you and I know what we're going to go for. We know what the kids are going to go for. They're going to go for the sugary chocolate milk. It just tastes better. And so from an intuitive eating perspective, if we're supposed to be feeling better about how we are, right, more compassionate, more body satisfaction, and being better and being more okay with the choices we've made, because that's really what intuitive eating is you need to be okay with the choices you've made. that doesn't necessarily lead us to better choices. And the research shows that that's true. Like intuitive eating doesn't necessarily mean you're going to eat less sweets or less fatty stuff. So it's hard for me to kind of reconcile, I think, the general public's idea of what intuitive eating is and then what I think it is or maybe what you think it is. So where do you sit on that? Like intuitive eating is not going to reduce the amount of sweets and fats you eat. I don't think. What do you think?
I agree with you. However, I think it goes back to your statement a while ago. I think there's too many individuals that are grabbing the book or they're just Googling intuitive eating. And I've seen this in my practice. They come in, well, I've been intuitively eating. And they tell me what they're doing. I'm like, you are not intuitively eating.
Give me an example.
Or they're still eating with a lot of restrictive patterns, or it's kind of like, I allow myself cookies on the weekend, but then they're having 6 or 8 cookies on the weekend because it's the cheat weekend, but they, for some reason, are calling that intuitively eating. Or they're not honoring their health, and so they're really not hardly eating any fruits or vegetables. They're not having hardly any protein. And then when you explain why your body needs that, and that's that big part of honoring your health, then, okay, let's talk about that balance part and where we should be getting that in. Or if they have diabetes, okay, we know that pancreas can only produce so much, well, if it's type 2, can only produce so much insulin at one time. Mm-hmm. So we need to be kind to that, which means that it can't tolerate or break down a whole lot of carbohydrates at one time. Mm-hmm. So to honor that, we have to be more consistent. And that's where we joked on social media. I refer to it as kind of like the suggested speed limit. So here's going to be your suggested speed limit of probably what you can handle and your body can handle at every meal. So let's try to stick between that.
Right. And not the release. I'm going to use a quote, releasing the need for an artificial structure of how to eat and instead letting the body's wisdom lead the way. Like, no, because when it's broken, it's going to lead me to Oreos and M&Ms. Like it just is.
Well, all right. And that's the next big one is I love to teach my clients, and I know you do too, about just how intricate our central nervous system is. And I talk about the vagus nerve and the gut being the second brain. So part of that suggested speed limit is when you're really stressed or running around, more than likely you cannot intuitive eat because you can't really connect with your body. We know that blood flow hormones are not being receptive to the digestive tract. The brain can't focus on all these different things. So sometimes we have to do option B. And option B may be what you pack for your lunch. It may be what you can grab, like Starbucks protein pack. I don't know why they call it protein pack. It's like a little Lunchable. Yeah. And that may not be what sounds good, or they may not be able to connect with their fullness, but it's that second best bet when they know that they're disconnected from their body and their brain at that moment.
So there is some need to structure and intuitive eating.
Yes.
If it's broken. Okay. Yeah. And that's where I think that guided process is required. Like there's something called unconditional permissions to eat, UPE. And that's where it reflects, it's like allowing oneself to eat the foods that's desired in the moment without forbidding any foods. That's like a slippery slope. I don't like to use that term, but allowing yourself to eat whatever you want, you don't forbid anything like that. Okay, that sounds great, but that's kind of what got us into the problem in the first place. So sometimes those are the elements or the terminology that I feel are taken away in the media. So maybe I have less of a problem with intuitive eating and it's my interpretation of what everybody else thinks it is. That's the problem. I'm not sure. So how do you feel about that? Like, allowing oneself to choose a food that's desired in the moment and not forbidding anything. Should it be isolated? It can't, in my opinion, be a way of life, but what's your thoughts?
So a lot of it depends on how often is that happening and what is driving them to choose that food, because what we don't want to miss, and this is where I think a lot of individuals with emotional eating and binge eating get overlooked, is because of that. I'm giving myself permission. It's not bad. Well, no, it's not bad to eat the food, but are we missing a coping skill that needs to be established that now has been ingrained for your brain, like Pavlov and the conditioning to turn to that food, because that is not the coping skill that we want. Emotional eating is not bad per se, but if you're turning to it all the time, now it is. It's like everything else. I love a good massage, But if I had a massage every single day, I'm not going to appreciate it. I'm not going to enjoy it as much. And the same thing happens if you're unconditionally giving yourself permission to eat that same food every single day. That's probably not pleasure. That's now become some sort of brain's response to stress that you're just giving yourself permission to do.
What a great explanation for joyless eating. So as a sports dietitian myself, so Rebecca and I, we're CSSDs, and so that's a board certified specialist in sports dietetics. We had to be dietitians for 5 years before we could take the exam, and we had to work with athletes for a 2-year period of time as mostly a full-time job before we could even do this, right? And so we're in tune with the nature of nutrition and performance fueling, and one of them is like in the media, the antithesis of what we believe is like it's that joyless eating. Like, oh, you shouldn't just eat because it's fuel. Well, you need to eat some things that work for you, right? And what you just explained to me is more joyless eating than eating, what you need for performance. Eating highly decadent foods all the time to the point where there's no enjoyment and you're just simply doing it out of habit or distractionary discomfort, right?
Right.
That is purely joyless eating. And I think a lot of people struggle with that because they no longer find enjoyment in eating because they have desensitized themselves to that enjoyment. Does that jive? Did I explain that well?
Yes. And so especially you're going to probably be better at this than I would, but like, I'll ask them like, well, how did that food taste? Because I can tell you, like the last time I had a flourless chocolate tort, I could tell you the texture, the taste, it was delicious. Right.
Yeah. Right.
But when we're mindless eating and I try to think of the last time I had a handful of M&Ms, I couldn't tell you what that actually tasted like. Were they fresh? Were they still? And so when you can have them start to use descriptors, remember that's going to pull them back into that mindful eating part. And if they weren't mindfully eating, they can't describe what that tasted like, where they were, what was the ambiance like where they were at.
Right. Yeah, because food's no longer an experience at that point, which takes us to emotional eating. Now, emotional eating has its own set of triggers. And emotional eating, I think intuitive eating helps us move away from intuitive eating. It's a great tool to help counteract emotional eating and I associate emotional eating and emotional hunger as that insatiable need to eat, even if you are full, right? Like I've eaten dinner, I am full, I've had M&Ms, I've had everything I needed, but I just need to eat. And so I'm either trying to distract myself from something that's uncomfortable, right? It's clearly an emotional eating aspect. Do you attach emotional eating to that same type of feeling? Where does emotional eating, how do you define that, or what are your signs?
Great question. But I think sometimes emotionally eating has to be distinguished from binge eating because one, you talk about the hormone cascade. We know that with binge eating, there's a huge insulin surge that actually drives that polyphagia, that severe hunger, and it actually becomes then synced with circadian rhythm. So if they tend to do that at 10 o'clock at night, that hunger is going to get turned on. Mm-hmm. Emotional eating can be any time of day. It doesn't have to be whether they're hungry, not hungry. And so it may just be, it's not enough that it would meet the DSM standard for binge eating.
To tell me more about binge eating, because this you do know, because you work in eating disorders, and right. I do not. As a matter of fact, I run from them rather quickly. And I just sent an email to an inquiry today about a mom looking for help for a 14-year-old daughter. And I said, look, I'm not the one that you want to talk to. You need a dietitian who can help you with ED. Not because this daughter had ED. She actually had an endocrinological problem, but she was ballooning up in weight rather quickly, right? And you need someone incredibly compassionate to help this young lady navigate body compassion and eating so we don't develop an eating disorder.
Right.
I know enough that I don't go there, and you do, so you know a lot. So tell me more about the binge eating and the circadian rhythm, because that is an area of interest for me where eating and sleeping, it's broken. We don't do it right. So tell me about that binge eating cascade and how that works.
So there's two different kinds of binge eating. There's subjective and objective. And so one can be from that rule-driven eating of I'm going to eat perfect all day. Oh no, I had this candy bar. I feel a sense of control. And they almost fog out because the anxiety comes with that. Okay. The other is how much volume in a short amount of time. So if it's 2,000 calories within a 2-hour window, both of those would be considered binge eating. Mm-hmm. what can happen is if it has met the criteria for DSM-5, that means that they probably are having 2 or more binges in a week of a larger amount of volume. And so for that digestive tract to get ready for that volume, it actually ends up increasing motility. It ends up increasing insulin to get prepared for it. And so even if they're trying not to binge, they end up really starved, anxious, all they can think about is food. So in treatment centers, they actually kind of feed them almost above what they need just to turn that down and allow them to work on the coping skills in between there. The other thing is, there's so many different complex reasons why somebody might binge. I had a lot of adolescents that would binge when they got home from school for at least 1 or 2 reasons. Procrastination of homework, they didn't want to do it. Mm-hmm. And some of these schools, they eat lunch at like 10:30 or 11, and they get home at 4, and that's like a whole nother meal time. And so then that becomes a conditioned response. Mm-hmm. So it's not only hormones that can start that, but also going back to, I use Pavlov all the time as a good example for them. You walk through the door, you put your homework down, you don't want to do it. And now your brain's like, hey, I've got this option that you can distract from and feel better. So then you end up binging as a result of that. There's a multitude of different reasons why. Emotionally eating can sometimes be, I think of it more mindless. A lot of times when somebody binges, they have it more planned out, or it ends up they go into the kitchen and then they decide they want to binge. I think of emotional eating as more grabbing like the M&Ms and continuing in the bag or potato chips or whatever else it is, but they don't necessarily get to the point of that physical discomfort and pain that we see with binging.
So where does boredom eating fall in? Is that emotional or binge? Or I guess if it's, you just answered the question there, if it becomes a discomfort, uncomfortable, it's a binge eating habit that you've cultivated, and otherwise it's distractionary emotional eating if you're trying to just kill time.
And I probably have oversimplified. I'm sure if there's eating disorder clinicians, they're like, oh, Becca, you did not get that very well. But for the lay public, that's how I try to explain it. And another huge component is they probably already have those eating disorder genetics. Mm-hmm. So it's one thing if somebody, emotionally eats and they're able to pull back and be like, okay, I notice this is not a pattern I want to get into. For somebody that has that eating disorder, brain genetics, the brain gets on fire and then they can't get out of that.
So, intuitive eating, again, we had talked about how everything was paired together, like, eating disorders not otherwise specified, which is a very broad spectrum of things that fall in between the bulimia and anorexia, right? And there's actually some other EDM or eating disorder classifications that I didn't cover that fit in there, but again, good enough for the government, right? It just needs to be So there's this whole paradigm of those eating disorders where it's binge eating, it's guilty after I'm eating, and intuitive eating is, as the studies have shown, is a great way to help improve that. But it needs to be a guided process.
Yes.
Like it's something that needs to be worked on. And then emotional hunger can also be a component of that. And we can use intuitive eating to help, at least be mindful of it. As a practitioner, like you're telling, and I'm asking you to tell me, like, because we're peers from a profession standpoint, right? And we each have our own specialty. Hey, Andrew, you just don't have this right about intuitive eating. I'd like you to rethink it. Is there anything that I've just abjectly missed? Like you're just wrong?
Not yet.
That's good. Okay.
And I always tell them that, especially as we talk about the sports world, everybody is unique. I've been doing this long enough that there are no cookie cutters. Just when you think you've got onto some cool pattern that you can do, the next one comes through the door and it doesn't work for them. And so with intuitive eating, that process, and it is a process, which means like anything, it has to be continual and ongoing. It's not like you check the boxes and boom, you're done for life. So it's going to evolve like the pandemic. What a great example of a time that probably everybody had to check in with how they're doing intuitively, because we're stressed, we're stuck at home, we're COVID cooking burnout or whatever that.
Right.
So we're finding more ways to be creative. Or I joked with my husband, like, we tend to prepare most meals at home, but it's like the first time I'm doing dishes 3 times a day. I'm like, I'm getting tired of this. Like, what things can we just heat up on a a plate and be done with? But there are always checkpoints that have to make us go back, and it looks different through our life. It looks different as an adolescent. And then for you and I, within our athletic population, I believe athletes can intuitively, but they definitely need structure and feedback, because we know the hormones that end up occurring afterwards blunt appetite for some, others it makes them really hungry. Their core temperature may be super hot, which makes them nauseous and they can't tolerate anything. Well, you can't tell them to honor their hunger and intuitively eat in that period. Right. They're going to need more prescribed nutrition.
And that's very sports specific. And we take a look at ultra runners, endurance runners, triathletes, where that high volume is an appetite suppressant. And then you throw that in with a different type of sport that's not like that, and then their hunger is upregulated and it becomes an issue. So hormones are playing a role everywhere that we are in the eating and nutrition. But I want to segue that into the body food choice congruence. So this was a term that I wasn't familiar with. And so body food choice congruence refers to the concept of gentle nutrition. And I like that term, gentle nutrition, when choosing healthy and tasty foods to support well-being. Like that's kind of, as dietitian to my dad, just like, that's my goal. Like, I was like, I want everybody to practice gentle nutrition. Like, what's good for you, yet still tasty and gets you to support your well-being, whether that be physical or mental, being psychologically less stressed about how you look, making better choices, which means then you're not as stressed, you don't binge eat, or emotionally. Like, there's this huge cascade of awesome things. Have you ever heard of that term, or have you heard it maybe coined as something differently?
I've heard gentle nutrition. I've never heard it in that term, but yeah, I love it, because I think too, because of over influence from social media, peers, parents have told them maybe from a young age, food has now taken a love-hate relationship. And it's really hard to have gentle nutrition when you're in that black or white category. And we know, like right now, fresh produce is in season, and sometimes, oh my gosh, a juicy peach is absolutely delicious. But do I want that all the time? No. Sometimes I want my Moose Tracks ice cream, and so it's not always going to be aligned. But for most part, you're looking at the taste preferential and what does my body need. I know too that I can't go have a huge old bowl of ice cream because my stomach is probably not going to tolerate that, but I may be able to have bigger volumes of other food. And I think finding, like, as we work with like FODMAPs, is like, it's not telling you need to cut all those foods out. It's saying when your stomach is stressed, you probably either A, may need to limit it at that time, or B, know what your threshold is before now your stomach can't tolerate anymore.
Right. The dose dependence nature of FODMAP was incredibly difficult to explain to individuals. Thankfully, Monash has made that much easier with the app. And I tell you that that's made counseling, because I have FODMAP. I deal with it, which is why it's a specialty that I work with. But yeah, it's a dose dependency, and don't omit it all, which takes me to what you said about like parents and children and that whole eating habits. Is like Ellen Satter, like, you're familiar with her work, the parents' role in meal times. A printout that I give just about every parent, but that takes me back to that broken nature of food, like at least maybe a broken relationship with food, is that clean plate club, or, hey, no, you can't have this until you finish the plate of food that I gave you. So for parents listening to this, like, you really do have a large impact on the relationship that your child has with food. If they sit down and you've made a plate for them and you gave them what you think they can eat and they don't, and then you get mad at them for not finishing it, it wasn't their choice. They didn't choose that food. And then cultivating that really stressful time at dinner, like, oh shit, here comes dinner time. Like, who's going to get yelled at? I'm not going to want to eat. And it cultivates bigger issues, right? And so that's where that, again, the intuitive eating for me, I'm like, man, I really think most of us are just really broken. Maybe it's not. Maybe they are, but what's not fixed is me as a practitioner to have said, hey, this is where intuitive eating fits. I see that we're broken. The process or the intuitive eating as a guide isn't broken. And that bring it together, Andrew, like make it make sense.
Yeah. And I mean, I empathize for parents because I know what it's like to have little stubborn people in your house. But what I've tried to do is use some of those models and be like, okay, like if you're going to prepare, and she's old enough now, she's actually a really good cook and bake baker I'm proud of. But okay, if you're going to make your plate, it has to have balance. So if you're going to have the slices of pizza, let's at least do some carrots and strawberries with it. And then making sure she's not distracted eating. I think that's been one of the biggest struggles that we've had, is then afterwards she's like, oh, my stomach hurts, mommy. I'm like, yeah, because I think you didn't even chew your food. And so, but that helped her because she wouldn't have put that together. And be like, oh yeah, I was like, sweetie, you need to sit up and slow down when you're eating, and then stop. And if you want to have the rest of that cake tomorrow, then fine, I'll wrap it up and put it on the counter. But I think they need to learn to put those together. And we, again, as parents, we give it that suggested speed limit. It says, here's what the parameters you have to work with. I'm going to let you choose, but I'm going to help guide you.
And slow down, like, make that cake last 15 spoonfuls versus 5. Like, it's the enjoyment. It's kind of like sex. We all wish it would last longer. With eating, we can actually have an impact, right? We can make it last longer, which is no problem. So everybody always wants, and that in the podcast, like, how do we give people who are listening or watching, like, something they can do? Like, you educated me on intuitive eating. You helped me place it in, like, maybe as a practitioner, the intuitive eating practice is good. It's beneficial. Maybe I had more problems with how the media portrayed it, not really how it was intended, which is good. What would you say to, and you can choose, just to the average individual about intuitive eating and how to get started, or the athlete intuitive eating and how to get started?
Well, I think both are going to be the same. I think sometimes you have to simply ask your body out loud what it needs. I think we have moved away from, and that's the whole thing of Western medicine, is being connected to that intuition, trusting it and learning from it, because a lot of times it's told you what it needed and you've missed the mark. And so being able to get back to that and start with something really simple. Do whatever meal of the day that you have the most quiet time to be able to kind of scan from head to toe. Just journal without trying to decipher what you're feeling, what you're noticing, and going from there. And then bring that in, if you can, to your clinician, and let's put the puzzle pieces together. That's what I always say, because a lot of times, even as dietitians, we need help from our peers and colleagues. And I remember one time I had to learn how to restand and walk because let my gait get off for so long that my foot was starting and all my nerve endings had changed, and I had to practice standing. And so sometimes we have to relearn concepts that we should have had from birth because we've compensated over time. And I think that's exactly what has happened with our eating. So instead of being competent eaters, we become incompetent by compensation.
Or incompetent by pure bad habit of repetition, because even the youngest of it, take a 10-year-old who's been eating for 9 years where they've been actively paying attention, right? They have their desires. Now you amplify that 20, 30, 40, 50, 60-year-old. Like, that's a lot of years of eating. That's a lot of repetitions. Yeah. Where we ingrain it completely wrong. So your takeaway is to find a mealtime where you can sit down, decompress, and then ask yourself, like, what do I need? Did I catch that right?
Yeah, exactly. Because a lot of times cravings are wisdom. And we've seen that with athletes when all of a sudden they're craving more red meat or their salt. Well, it could be related to their hydration. And so being able to bridge that together, then that starts to form that trust. Because a lot of times if they're coming to see us because they want to learn how to intuitively eat, they probably have a lot of distrust with their body, and you can't listen to that intuition if you don't even trust it.
Yeah. I can't think of a time where I would have sat down and said, and we do this, we read, like, I just trained, like, I'd never have a desire for chocolate cake or M&Ms, right? It's always like, where is like a meal? Like, I need a potato and some meat and a lot of vegetables. Like, I need a huge salad, something salty. Like, what's going on? It's always the other times where I'm like, oh my God, chocolate cake, oatmeal raisin cookies. It's like when I'm not being mindful about it, those don't come. So that's very interesting. What happens if I sit down and I'm mindful and I'm like, man, I want the M&Ms. I'm an adult. I should have them, right?
Right. So then you sit down and you savor and enjoy it, and then try to figure out where that satisfaction factor is. That This is very oversimplified, but yet it seems to be aligned with what I find in my practice. When you take that point where you go, oh, that was yummy, that usually means you're satisfied and time to be done. I always joke, like, when you had a cheesecake, how many bites was it where you feel, that's yummy and rich? Almost everybody says 4 or 5 bites. So I challenge your listeners to do that as an experiment and see what they find.
Yeah, like to actually enjoy it for those moments to make it last. That takes it back to the make it last. Well, that's awesome. Rebecca's a lot of fun, isn't she? I enjoyed talking to her. It was a hell of a lot of fun. It was a wonderful opportunity for me to learn, which is how this whole video started. I wanted to become a better practitioner and improve, or at least challenge my expectations and belief system in intuitive eating. I think that's important for all practitioners to do, is challenge their beliefs, get out of their own bubble, tell other people what they think, and have people push back. I learned a lot. I hope you did too. Hit the subscribe button, follow my channel, go to Instagram, Andrew D. Chef RD, hit me up there so you can find out all the cool things that I do as a chef and sports dietitian. Thanks.